There we go. Hi, everyone. So happy to see you. In honor of our guest of honor, we're starting in Israeli Standard Time. And I always run 10 to 15 minutes late, which makes me Jewish. Anyway, our guest of honor is here on the bima. You are all here. Thank you so very much for being here tonight. You are in for such a treat. Before I begin doing what I do best, which is talking, I am so thrilled to first welcome Matti Friedman and to welcome everyone who's watching online. You're welcome to leave comments, but we will not be responding to the comments just because A, we kind of don't have to anymore, and B, it was really hard juggling being in front of everyone and reading comments and responding. And you are welcome to come back and be with us. I want to thank Gail Gob-Martin, who is my person, for all of the work that she did in organizing tonight. She's not with us, but when you hear someone answer the phone at the shul, that is Gail. I want to thank Robin Roeder, our chief communal and executive officer, for all the behind-the-scenes work that she does day in and day out to make us all look good. I want to thank the members of our Centennial Scholars Committee, those who are here, those who are watching at home, and it's my great, great pleasure to welcome and thank Stephanie for running our online awesome high-def experience and sound. So Stephanie, thank you. Some of you know Pam and Bruce Meyer. Some of you may not. Pam and Bruce have been members of Congregation Beth Israel, predating Steve Kahn, and which means over 20 years. Pam is currently the president of the JNF board for Arizona, and Bruce is a member of the board of directors of Congregation Beth Israel, and they were the very first gift to our Centennial Torah program. So they get the honor of introducing our guest of honor, and so Pam and Bruce, welcome to the bima. Pleased to introduce our good friend Matti, and this was all Pam's idea anyway. It was. She said we should have Matti Friedman, and here you are. So turning it over to you, I actually have you guys on that side. Thank you.
I could use this one. You can use that. Thank you, Stephen. Rabbi Kahn. On behalf of Congregation Beth Israel, we'd like to welcome you to our fifth event in this year's Centennial Scholars Program. It is a great honor and joy to welcome Matti Friedman to Arizona as we continue to celebrate our historic congregation. As you know, our Centennial Scholars Program is the result of generous gift to CBI's Centennial Torah Project. We are grateful to these individuals and families who joined us in making this evening possible. I personally want to thank Matti for coming here all the way from Israel. I think you all find him a great speaker, and with that, I'll turn it over to Pam.
Good evening. Matti Friedman is an award-winning journalist and an author who lives with his family in Jerusalem. His work has taken him from Israel to Lebanon, Morocco, Moscow, and Washington, D.C. A former AP correspondent and essayist for the New York Times opinion section, he currently writes a monthly feature for Tablet magazine. His writing has appeared in Smithsonian Magazine, The Atlantic, and many other prestigious periodicals. Matti is an acclaimed author. The Aleppo Codex, his first book published in 2014, and winner of the 2014 Sammy Rohr Prize and the ALA Sophie Brody Medal, is the story of an investigation into the strange fate of an ancient Bible manuscript and was translated into 7 languages. Matti's 2016 book, Pumpkin Flowers, A Soldier's Story of a Forgotten War, received several literary awards, including the selection as a New York Times notable book and as one of Amazon's 10 best books of the year. In 2018, Matti's Spies of No Country won the Natan Book Award and the Canadian Jewish Book Award. And let us be among the first to wish you a special mazel tov on the publication of your new book, Who by Fire, which is now available on Amazon. And our first book that he actually had to buy himself is right there. right? In this new book, Matti shares the little-known story of Leonard Cohen's concert tour to the front lines of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, including never-before selections from an unfinished manuscript by Cohen and rare photographs. Matti is a magnificent storyteller who is able to weave, narrate, teach, and entertain us all in his books. I cannot wait to read this new book. In recent years, Matti's intellect, writings, and passion for the ideals of the State of Israel has made him one of the most important Zionist thinkers of our time. And this is why he is our Centennial Scholar this evening. I personally had the opportunity to introduce Matti on his last speaking engagement in Phoenix right before COVID in February of 2020, and am more than thrilled that you are back. Matti, it is a great honor to welcome you to our historic congregation and a fitting tribute to our 100-plus year commitment to the people and state of Israel. Please join us in sharing a heartfelt Baruch Haba to Matti Friedman.
Matti, welcome.
I think I'm going to be a grave disappointment after that introduction.
Well, if anything, I was joking earlier that Matti, when we were on the way from the airport, he was supposed to be with Rabbi David Wolpe last night in Los Angeles, but Rabbi Wolpe got COVID, so there was a sub. This would have been very underwhelming after David Wolpe. And then you're going to be in Manhattan at the Temple Emmanuel Adult Learning Program, and here you are in Scottsdale, Arizona for like your second or third time. So we're big fans, but it's our first time meeting. And I said earlier, and I will say to you, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, I mean, Matti Friedman is a big deal right now, but in 5, 10 years, you will be among the people who say, wait, he spoke at our temple? Matti is a prolific, through his journalism, through his storytelling, a prolific Zionist thinker. And of the next generation, meaning of the post-Yom Kippur War generation. And I think for us, for those who are coming to Israel with us in June, for our 42 big trip campers who are going to be in Israel in June, for the world, it's good to have people like Matti Friedman, not only as spokespeople of Zionism and Israel's cause, but for the Jewish cause. And I'm just so, so grateful, and I can't wait. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to start asking you questions. So
I should come here more often.
You should.
Really, it's a big ego boost.
You're always welcome. Matti, you just wrote this book that when I picked you up at the airport, first thing I said was, how did you stumble upon by accident, or was it intentional to find this trough, this treasure trove of Leonard Cohen, the Yom Kippur War, the IDF, 1973. Can you walk us through how this project, it's fascinating to me how this happened, and you take someone, and we'll get to it in a second, about a guy who you may not have connected the dots with the State of Israel, how you came upon this, what happened?
First of all, it's so nice to be here in person, not looking at a screen, and it's wonderful to be in Phoenix. How many Leonard Cohen fans are in? Wow, not
and
bad.
Cantor is doing Shiva. Had he not, I would have asked him to start, and he would have been more than happy to start with a Leonard Cohen song. But nonetheless,
Can you deliver?
You can.
I was born and raised in Canada. So if you're Canadian, then Leonard Cohen looms large in your cultural imagination. And I don't remember the first time that I heard Suzanne and So Long Marianne and those great Leonard Cohen songs, because they were just always on. So that's true of Canadian kids, and it's definitely true of Canadian Jewish kids. And I don't want to insult Canada or anything, but we haven't produced that many cultural figures of global significance. So Leonard Cohen's a big deal. So I grew up on Leonard Cohen. Of course, it was my parents' music. And I moved to Israel when I was 17. That was 1995, intending to be there for 1 year, and then ended up staying for 27 and counting. And didn't think much about Leonard Cohen for the first couple of years that I spent in Israel. And in 2009, Cohen showed up in Israel. And if you might remember that Cohen had the most remarkable last act maybe in music history, right? He's really a figure of the 60s. He somehow manages to remain famous throughout the 80s with songs like Hallelujah. And then he disappears into a Buddhist monastery for about 10 years and comes out to discover that his manager had stolen all of his money. And his bank account was empty, and he had to go back on the road again in his mid-70s just to make some cash. And when he went back on the road, he discovered, to his surprise, that he had ascended to the pantheon of music fame. And he was filling stadiums around the world. And he turned out to be this beloved global figure. And I think he was quite taken aback by it. The last concert in that first Resurrection tour was in Tel Aviv. And he showed up in Israel, or news of the concert started to spread in Israel. And I realized that Israelis venerated Leonard Cohen. And I don't know if any of you have ever, lived in Israel and kind of experienced the strange Israeli love for Leonard Cohen. But when tickets went on sale for that concert, within a few minutes, all the phone lines had crashed. And 50,000 people eventually showed up in a very small country. Of course, that's a large number. Israelis love Leonard Cohen. And it's not just because he's Jewish. There are many other Jewish artists, for example, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is, admired in Israel, but people don't love him like they love Leonard Cohen. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. Like, what is this thing with Leonard Cohen? I get why Canadians love Leonard Cohen, but what's the story here in Israel? There seemed to be something that I hadn't quite understood about the connection between this artist and these people. And then I saw an article in one of the Israeli dailies that told the story of what seemed to me the weirdest concert tour in the history of rock music, which was a tour that Cohen did in the middle of the Yom Kippur War at the front in Sinai. He showed up at the darkest moment of Israel's history. The army's in disarray. There are thousands of fatalities. Things are going very, very poorly after the surprise attack on Yom Kippur by Egypt and Syria, right, October 6, 1973. And many of you might even remember that moment. And out of this...
And that was not part of Israeli pop culture history, meaning you really didn't know until these tickets sold out and you were kind of
right. So it turned out that
looking for it.
That's right. It turned out to be a kind of underground history for Israelis. So it had never been spelled out, but people knew. People remembered that at this moment of crisis, out of the smoke of battle in Sinai, Leonard Cohen came with a guitar on some strange Jewish quest, and it seemed to me to be a story that someone needed to tell.
So what was the next step? So 2009, obviously the book is coming out next week officially. So kind of walk us through the steps of your discovery. Because I think it's just fascinating. Yes, Israelis are passionate for the arts in general, but there are certain acts, certain people will show up and the tickets are gone in seconds. And it's not just Justin Bieber, right? It's
mostly Justin Bieber.
Correct, but it's also, you're right, filling up a 50,000 seat soccer stadium is...
Another great Canadian, by the way, Justin Bieber.
I did not know. But to kind of walk us through the steps of your discovery as you started to dig into this.
So the first step was to try to find soldiers who'd seen Cohen in Sinai. There was no account of this beyond a few press articles that were often contradictory. And there were soldiers who'd seen Cohen in concert during the war, and there were musicians who had toured with Cohen. And I started over, and this took many years, right? This is 2009 that I hear about this tour, and the book is coming out now, so you can do the math. It took a while to put it all together. But I started looking for soldiers, and Israel being what it is, it's a very small country. So if you meet one person, they'll give you a phone number, and then you're with the next person, and then you've got 6 more phone numbers, and then pretty soon you've got the entire infantry of 1973.
Given how traumatizing the Yom Kippur was, especially for those in the Sinai, it must have been hard to get, not necessarily this story, but some contact, because I know of all the wars, that is probably the most triggering, Lebanon being a separate topic, for those who were in tanks in the Sinai in 1973.
Sure, it's a scar that runs across the Israeli psyche to this day. And you really can't understand Israel without understanding the Yom Kippur War. The country after Yom Kippur is a different country than the one it was before. And that's true nationally, and it's true personally for guys who found themselves in Sinai exposed on October 6, 1973, when the Egyptians came across and the Israelis were outnumbered and outgunned and were overrun in a matter of hours. Israel lost 2,600 fatalities in that war, which may not seem like a lot in a country like America, but in a country like Israel, which at the time was 3 million people. That was a lot. So it's a traumatic memory, and some people don't like to talk about it, but actually those guys are now and women, I should say, because some of the characters in the book are women who were in the war. They are now at a point in their life where they want to talk. It's safe enough time has gone by. So people were quite enthusiastic, and I found, one person who had seen Cohen, and I understood from that he'd been at a certain base at a certain time. I went to the IDF archive to see if there's a list of concerts, of Cohen concerts. No such thing exists. It was just chaos. So no one was, keeping track of Leonard Cohen, which is why, by the way, he could arrive at the very edge of the front in Sinai. He crosses the Suez Canal a day behind the Israeli army. So it's not like a Bob Hope situation where it's not the USO. It's not like a safe base in the rear. He's at the front, or that scene from Apocalypse Now with the Playboy bunnies. I don't know if you remember that scene. So it wasn't like that. He was really with the soldiers at the front, and it's because no one was keeping track of the musicians. I asked a musician who played with Cohen who organized the tour, and when I said the word organized, he cracked up, because the idea that this was organized is hilarious. First of all, in Israel, very little is organized, and it was a war, and it was completely ad hoc. It happens, it starts when Cohen, we can talk about why he came to Israel. It's a bit of a complicated story, but just the technicalities of how he reached the front was that he's sitting in a cafe in Tel Aviv at the beginning of the war, and he's recognized by a few Israeli musicians who are also in the cafe, and one of them says, "That's Leonard Cohen." And the other one says, "No way, that's not Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen isn't in Tel Aviv in the Yom Kippur War." And the first musician says, "I'm going to prove it to you." And he walks up to Leonard Cohen, and it turns out to be Leonard Cohen. And they convince Leonard Cohen to come with them to play for troops, which in Israel, in America, if you want to play for troops, that means flying 8,000 miles away to Vietnam or Iraq to play for troops. But in Israel, you get into your car and you drive for about an hour, and you're at the front. In this case, the car was a Ford Falcon belonging to a singer named Oshik Levy, and they pile into the Falcon, and they set off to find the war, and that's how the story starts.
So talk a little bit about his Jewishness, and why is he in Israel? And is it related to his Jewishness or not?
So there's a few different things going on. Leonard Cohen is 39 years old, and he's having a crisis. 39 is kind of a prime age for a male crisis.
So if you're having a crisis, why not go to Israel and enter the chaos there, right?
Exactly. So I think this crisis, the national crisis, offers him a way out of his personal crisis. He's living on a Greek island called Hydra. I don't know if any of you saw the recent documentary that came out called Leonard and Marianne, about this great love affair he had on Hydra. Marianne by this time is gone. There are many female characters who kind of come in and out of Leonard Cohen's life, of course. And he's living with a woman named Suzanne and with their son, Adam, who is 1 year old. So he has a family and he has a child, and he's 39. His music career is going very poorly. He's kind of given up on the music business. He has announced that he's retiring. He's kind of hit a creative dead end. And, that wouldn't surprise anyone. He's a 39-year-old, singer that most people flame out before they're 39 in the music world, so that wouldn't have surprised anyone. So he's having a hard time. He feels like he's stuck, like he's stranded, and he hears on the radio on Yom Kippur that war has broken out in Israel. And surprising himself, I think, he gets on a ferry from the island to Athens, gets the first flight from Athens to Tel Aviv, and inserts himself into this Israeli war. And I think that so there are complicated motivations here. Part of it is that Leonard Cohen is trying to get out. Right? Part of it is a push factor more than a pull factor. But I think we have to remember, and I think many people here do remember, that a crisis in Israel in the old days used to affect people kind of like the bat signal. Remember in the old Batman TV series where you'd see like this bat projected on the sky? And for Jewish people, it was kind of, it was an emergency. And there are many stories that maybe some people here know, Jewish doctors hearing about the war on Yom Kippur in synagogue, packing up their medical instruments and flying to Israel. And there are dozens of stories like that. So there was a need to be there. This is a moment of existential crisis. The Jews are in trouble. Leonard Cohen is a deeply Jewish character, and he just needs to be there. And when he arrives in Israel, he immediately identifies in a very deep and kind of instinctive way with the Jews, to such an extent that he asks people to call him Eliezer, which is his Hebrew name. Leonard Cohen is a strange name for Israelis, and Israelis really butcher the name Leonard. If you ever ask Israelis to say Leonard, it's still to this day, we call him Leonard Cohen. But Eliezer Cohen is like every second person in Israel. It's like John Smith. It's like everyone. So he's kind of starts calling himself John Smith. So he fits in, and he wears something that looks like a uniform, and he's very much with the troops. And he writes a song, which I don't know if you want to talk about the song that kind of expresses this, but do you guys know the song Lover, Lover, Lover? It's not as famous as Hallelujah, but it's one of Cohen's most beloved songs, and he played it throughout his career. And it turns out to have been written at an Israeli Air Force base. And it was written out of a deep identification with the Israelis. And if you listen to the lyrics of that song today, there are some strange lyrics that don't make sense if you think it's a love song, but make sense if you understand that he's singing it to, in this case, an auditorium full of Israeli pilots and navigators who were being shredded by anti-aircraft missiles over the Golan and over Sinai. It was the worst week in the history of the Israeli Air Force, and the losses were so bad in the Air Force that the Israeli public was not being told what those losses were. So he's playing for them, and he knows that it might be the last thing they hear. And he sings this song for them that he writes in his notebook, and I've seen the notebook, and the song includes lines like, "May this song be a shield for you against the enemy." That's a line that remains in the song, but there's also a verse that disappears from the song.
Which is?
When I started looking for soldiers who'd seen Cohen, I met a guy named Shlomi. Shlomi had been in a kind of ad hoc commando force that had been involved in some of the worst of the fighting around the Suez Canal, and he described this scene to me from the war that sounded like a hallucination. I wasn't actually sure that he was really remembering something that had happened, or if he was hallucinating, and anyone who's been in a war-like situation knows that memory does strange things.
Sure.
And I know that from my own experience. So he tells a story that he was out in the desert looking for fuel for his Jeep. They'd run out of fuel, and he couldn't find any fuel, and he was walking back towards this encampment where he and his friends were set up on the far side of the Suez Canal, the Egyptian side of the canal. And he approaches the encampment, and he hears a voice. Shlomi is like a very blunt guy. He's kind of an Israeli, like a blunt Israeli. He's not a flowery poet type. But he described it like this. He said, I was walking in the desert, and I heard a voice, and it was like Moses hearing the voice of God. And he sees this figure who's sitting on an upside-down helmet on the sand with a guitar, and it's Leonard Cohen in the Sinai Desert in the Yom Kippur War. And he can't believe it. That makes no sense that Leonard Cohen would be in the middle of the war, but it's definitely Cohen, and he's singing a song that he doesn't know because Lover, Lover, Lover had just been written in the war, so no one knew it. And he says there's one verse in particular that I'll never forget, and it's the verse where Leonard Cohen called us his brothers. Israelis always want to know, are you with us? Are you one of us? Are you just watching us? Are you like from the UN? Or are you here with us? And Eliezer Cohen, at that moment, was with the Israelis, and according to Shlomi, called them his brothers in the song Lover, Lover, Lover. The problem is, there is no such verse in the song Lover, Lover, Lover. And you can, get on YouTube after this talk and you'll hear it for yourself. And I was sure he was wrong or making it up, and then I got access to Cohen's notebooks, these notebooks that he kept in his pocket throughout his life, and that's where he writes his first drafts, and that's where you see I've seen the first draft of Chelsea Hotel in his handwriting, like as it comes out of his head. I remember you well in the Chelsea Hotel. It's like you're seeing something being born, and I won't give you the next couple sentences because it's a synagogue, and we might, we don't want to get, no, you can Google it afterward.
So it's like you found the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right, exactly. And in the notebook, but judging from the laughter, some people know what I'm talking about.
Go ahead, please.
So the verse that I found in the notebook goes like this. It's a verse, by the way, that's been lost for 50 years and has just resurfaced. I went down to the desert to help my brothers fight. I knew that they weren't wrong. I knew that they weren't right. But bones must stand up straight and walk, and blood must move around, and men go making ugly lines across the holy ground. It's not a bad verse.
Do you think Leonard Cohen had an image of Ezekiel's passages about the calling
About
upon
the bones.
The dry bones to be given life, that he has a sense of, let's call it achim, that there is this idea of brotherhood that is unrivaled In elite forces, obviously, it's not unrivaled, right? Elite, whether they're Navy SEALs or, but in general, in the general ranks, does he have a sense of these prophetic words?
Absolutely. Leonard Cohen is steeped in the language of prophecy. That's his juice. I mean, he grows up in a synagogue, a very serious Canadian institution called Shar Shamayim. His grandfather is a very learned rabbi who's called the Prince of Grammarians, Sar HaDikduk. He was an expert in Hebrew grammar. So Leonard Cohen knows.
They're some of my favorite people. We have a member, our camp director, Jason Bronowitz, who's brilliant, and he loves biblical Hebrew. I received a 73 in biblical Hebrew. I couldn't get the Vav Hayipuch right, but nonetheless, he really is intentionally using imagery from the prophets, not only in this song that you found, but can you relate that also to this idea that you brought into the book, which is he refers to Israel as a mythic home?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that too.
Sure. When he comes back from the war, he writes a manuscript about the war. One of the weirdest things about the story is that Leonard Cohen never mentions it. He almost never talks about having been in the Yom Kippur War, which is weird when you understand how important it was for him and for the people who saw him, but he almost never mentions it. And it was kind of a stroke of luck that I found a manuscript that he'd written immediately upon his return and had never published. And it is 45 typed pages of raw Cohen, like unfiltered, really weird Leonard Cohen from the heart. And he tells about this time in the war, and some of it's in the book. I kind of let him tell part of the story. And he refers to Israel at one point as his myth home. He says, I'm going to my myth home. What the hell is a myth home? And I don't even think he knew necessarily what a myth home was, but I think any Jewish person basically gets that, even if we can't quite spell out what it means. What is a myth home? And I think that's also one reason that often people come to Israel expecting a myth home and are thrown by what they find, because it doesn't feel like home. You know, it's a strange country in the Middle East, and parts of it are exciting, parts of it feel like it's ours, but it doesn't behave exactly like a home. But I think he has that idea that he's going home and that these are his brothers. And that's very much how he feels during the war, but it changes. But it changes for Cohen. And at the end of the war, I think he feels like he's gone too far in his tribal identification. And there's a moment that he describes in his manuscript where it seems like a breaking point for Cohen almost. So he's been spending weeks with the soldiers, and he's Eliezer and my brothers, and then he describes a moment where he's at an airbase and a helicopter lands with wounded soldiers. And these guys are shredded, and they're in really bad shape. And this is one of many very upsetting things Cohen saw, because he was at the front, and he's kind of rattled by it. And the musicians who are with him see that Cohen is rattled, and they say, "Don't worry, Leonard, these are Egyptians." And he's relieved. And then he catches himself and he says, "How could you be relieved? Like, why are you relieved that these are Egyptians?" And he says, and I'm quoting more or less verbatim, he says, "I hate this relief. This is blood on your hands." Like, the idea that it's okay that these are Egyptians, but it wouldn't be okay if they were Jews, that idea goes against everything Leonard Cohen believes as an artist and as a person. And from that point on, you can tell that he's stepping back from his identification. And in that verse that I just read, that incredible line where he says, "I went down to the desert to help my brothers fight," there's a line drawn through that. He crosses out the line, and he writes over those words, he writes, "I went down to the desert to watch the children fight." So he's watching. Wow. He's not helping. And it's not my brothers, it's the children. And ultimately he crosses the verse out entirely, and it disappears. It doesn't exist in Lover, Lover, Lover. And by 1960, and this is its first publication, by the way. And in 1976, so a few years after the war, he's giving a concert in France. You can find this on YouTube. And he introduces Lover, Lover, and he says he wrote it in the Yom Kippur War for the Egyptians and the Israelis, in that order. So he steps back into his universal position as a poet who needs to be bigger than just the Israelis and bigger than this specific war.
Wow. I mean, the transformation that you just described is going to lead in nicely to the next part, because I think it has a lot to do with the general American, not all diaspora, but American idealism and idealization of Israel that has hit a breaking point for a lot of American Jews. And we can tell our 20-year-olds and our 25-year-olds and our 30-year-olds that they're terrible, awful Jews for saying and believing what they think. But look, we put Israel on the same pedestal. I'm guilty of that as well. But we also bring lots of kids to Israel. We teach Zionism from a variety of perspectives, but we will never, as long as I'm senior rabbi here, we will never criticize Israel from this bima, ever. But I'm a different generation, and I accept the fact that there's another generation that does idealize Israel, that's had it with this Zionist experiment, with this nationalism. It's anti-American, it's un-American, it's undemocratic, it's misogynistic. And yet, ironically, LGBTQ American 20-somethings don't realize what LGBTQ rights look like in Israel, and more importantly, what they look like not in Israel, what they look like in the Palestinian authorities' lands, what it looks like in Gaza, what it looks like in Saudi Arabia, what it looks like in Jordan. They don't care. Is Israel that bad a behavior, the behaviors of Israel that bad that we can't any longer transmit to American Jewish, and it's not just kids, I mean, just read every study, that we can't transmit this idea that Israel is both democratic, open, progressive, liberal, and deeply seeped in tradition, that Zionism is different, and that both can exist, and we can tolerate any of these ambiguities without having to turn our backs on Israel. And the second part of that question is, so in other words, does Leonard Cohen turn his back on Israel? Is that the next chapter? So 1967, we're tripling the size of Israel. We've got soldiers at the wall with the rifles on their back praying at the wall. And in 1973, there's this huge upheaval, and obviously this lie told to Leonard Cohen backfires, that these are not Egyptians, they're Israelis, but he doesn't know that. So kind of, when does that start to spin? When, and where are we? We always talk about what Israelis think about Americans and Americans think about Israeli, but what is the situation? That was a very long, convoluted question. I was trying to get to the question, and I just kept talking. So the question
The answer is yes.
Where
yes.
are we at? Because I was really blown away by the Leonard Cohen story. Where are we at? Are we the Leonard Cohen pre-soldiers coming off the airplane? Have we idealized Israel? They're our brothers? Or is it post that moment? And had they read this book, would he have sold out the show in 2009?
Those are all good questions.
There was one good question and about 15 minutes of just thinking out loud. I was really blown away by that story.
I think the trick is to stop thinking in terms like myth home and stop thinking in terms of myth entirely, because no real country or no real person could ever live up to being a myth, right? If you imagine that someone is a myth, you will be disappointed because no one is. And if you imagine that a country is a myth, you're going to go there and you're going to be shattered when you discover that it's just a crappy country like every other country on planet Earth. And what Zionism really gave the Jews is not some kind of utopia. It is another crappy country on planet Earth, which for us is an incredible accomplishment. And thank God we have it. And I've lived there for 27 years and I love it more now than I did when I moved there. But I have no... it's not a myth home, right? It's as flawed as any other country. We have short-sighted politicians and moral blindness and bad traffic and sewage problems and you name it, the usual package of human nonsense. None of which is very mythical. It only looks mythical if you're far away. The problem is if you teach people about a myth, they're going to discover that they've been lied to, and they're going to flip when they realize that it's BS. So I think it's very important to generations have shifted, and we can't keep teaching Israel as it was taught, 20, 30, 50 years ago. It's not the kibbutzniks dancing around the campfire, and it's not Golda Meir. By the way, even Golda Meir and the kibbutzniks were not Golda Meir and the kibbutzniks. That was also a myth. It's not like there was something that existed that no longer existed.
So they didn't all dress like and look like Paul Newman from Exodus.
No, we still do. We still do.
If you can find me the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Israeli kibbutzniks who drink cognac,
yes.
I would be thrilled.
I mean, that's a good example of a myth, right? It's an American tradition. Paul Newman, we're of course talking about Ari ben Canaan, the main character from Exodus, which is this seminal work of art, I guess it's kind of work of art, for Americans in the 50s and 60s. That is an American archetype. And that myth of the frontiersman, he's blonde and blue-eyed and he drinks cognac and he knows how to dance, he knows like ballroom dancing. Now, no Israeli kibbutz pioneer knew how to do the foxtrot, or they would definitely not drink cognac because that was bourgeois. And if you ever saw the kibbutz pioneers, like the heroes of Israel's founding, they didn't look like Paul Newman, they looked like Groucho Marx. That's what they look like, right? And have you ever seen a picture of Ben Gurion? Did he look like?
So what you're saying is they look like me, kind of.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay,
So I think
good.
we have to get away. I think to get away from mythologizing and understand that there's something about Israel that suggests mythology, and it kind of invites people to project their own myths onto it. And some of those myths are positive, like the Ari ben Canaan myth and the Leonard Cohen myth home idea. Increasingly, we're seeing myths of a different kind, which are poisonous kind of libels, in which Israel is, or a fictitious version of Israel is held up to serve as a kind of example of what's wrong in the world. So the ultimate symbol of colonialism, of racism, of apartheid, right? That's a word that you hear, used about Israel and about basically no other country. So there's a kind of mythology that attaches itself to Israel, and I think we have to get away from all mythologies. So the response to the apartheid mythology is not to say, no, it's actually Ari ben Canaan and the kibbutz of our imagination. No, what Israel is a flawed country on planet Earth. It's not more flawed than America. And people live in America and pay taxes to the American government and look outside their window and see all kinds of terrible things in America and things that America has done outside of America, and we live with it because that's what being a human, that's what being an adult is on planet Earth. You live with complexity and you understand that being an adult means that your hands are dirty, and that's necessary, that's life. And Israel is part of the world, and that's what it means to have a state. It doesn't mean we have a utopia. It means that, like everyone else, our hands are dirty. There are no myths. That's where we have to be, and I think that's where we have to be in our education.
Do you feel like there's a resentment on the part of, and resentment's a very harsh and strong word, but it's the word I came up with, a resentment on the part of Israelis that American Jews have used that myth for so long, or at least envisioned that mythical, idealized Israel for so long that they really want no part of it. Like, I get the sense sometimes in speaking to Israelis and being in Israel that they're really kind of done with us. They're ready to go on their own, and they kind of don't want the American Jew coming with their big checks.
I think they're happy for the checks, don't get me wrong. But
with the expectation of the plaque going up on the drip irrigation system.
Right.
I mean,
I know exactly.
Really, I know it sounds crude.
No, I get it.
But that they're just sort of done.
These are two, and we spoke about this briefly before the talk, these are two increasingly different Jewish worlds.
I think it's a very important part of the conversation.
That increasingly don't understand each other. And
Right.
the expectation that it's just going to work like it worked in the 50s, where, one Ashkenazi Jew came from New York and gave money to another Ashkenazi Jew who lived in Tel Aviv. It's not going to work like that anymore. The countries are too different. American Jews have been formed by years in the United States, which is a very different political culture. It's just a different way of being Jewish, a different way of being, period. Well, at the same time, Israelis have gone through 3, 4, 5 generations of being in the Middle East and being Middle Easternized. And we were talking about this as well earlier. At least half of the Jewish population of Israel is Middle Eastern and North African in origin, what we would call Mizrahi, which is this really broad generalization for anyone who comes from the Islamic world. Well, the American Jewish community, or the North American Jewish community, I should say, as a Canadian, is at least 90% of East European origin, Ashkenazi. And that's what makes the two worlds really, really different, because being a Jew from Morocco is really different than being a Jew from Warsaw. And if we want to understand Israel today, 2022, we have to think a lot less about Warsaw and a lot more about Damascus and Kurdistan and places that seem really far away and hard to understand for Americans. But that's where Israel is, and it's those forces that are forming Israelis, and kind of that communication. We have to acknowledge that it's going to be increasingly difficult, not have the expectation that's going to be easy, drop the easy stories that we still tell about Israel, which are dated, and encourage people to interact with each other. I think Israelis have a lot to learn from American Jews and don't. And I think that if American Jews can interact with Israel and kind of hook themselves up to the incredible fuel that Israel produces, it will, enrich the American Jewish experience immeasurably, because Israel is alive. It's electric. There's nothing artificial about it. It's not a project that's funded by foreign donors. If you've been to Tel Aviv in the past 10 years, 20 years, it's one of the greatest cities in the world. And the culture that's coming out of Israel is absolutely amazing. And the buzz on the street is crazy. And it's happening. And if you are an American Jew looking for some kind of electricity in your Jewish life, you'll find it in Israel. But in order to find it, you need to be able to understand the country.
Yet, all the Jews who were killed this week by terrorists in Bnei Brak and in the south, Israel still responds within as a family, correct? There's a cohesiveness to it still, right?
Yes, I think it's increasingly under fire, as it is in America, by social media, kind of binary erosion of public discourse. That's happening everywhere, and that's something to be worried about, in my opinion. I'm more worried about that than I'm worried about the Iranians, for example. Right. And it's happening in Israel. But certainly Israel is more cohesive than this country is, in part because the threats are so immediate, and also because Israel, after all, is a tribe. And our very vicious arguments with each other are kind of family arguments, like you have vicious arguments with your brother or with your parents. And Israel is still a cohesive place where people feel responsible for one another. And you can feel it this week. We've had a really terrible week of kind of random terror attacks that are very frightening on the streets of Israel. And a bunch of people have been killed, by the way, not just Jews. 2 Ukrainians were killed.
Recently refugeed from Ukraine.
Apparently
correct?
They were working in Israel. They were foreign workers in Israel. Right. But when I saw that, I almost thought that a news editor had become confused and had got the wires crossed on the news stories that Ukrainians are being killed in Israel. But 2 of those guys were Ukrainians, and the police officer who played a role in stopping the terrorist and who was killed by the terrorist was Arab. He was an Arab Christian. And things are very complicated in Israel, right? So it's not the old story about a certain kind of person. There are all kinds of people in Israel, and that's what makes the place tragic on occasion, but also such an interesting place to cover as a reporter.
I have many, many more questions about that, but we're limited time, and I do want to get to your questions. So I just want to go to one more topic, which we'll save the easiest one for last, but I want to thank you for that. If you want to have more conversations about the U.S.-Israel Jewish Israeli conversation, you have to come in June or November with us to Israel, and we'll be talking to you and talking to Danny Gordis and a bunch of other people in Israel while we're there, because that's the best place to have the conversation. The last question I had in our general dialogue before we turn it over to the crew over here, Ukraine, the war. Is Israel polarized or struggling with the decisions that the Knesset, that the Security Council of Israel, that they've made, the National Security Council has made regarding how deeply engaged they want to get between their alliance with the United States, Great Britain, France, so on and so forth, and not fully engaging in sanctions against Russia? Is there polarization in Israel over that?
I wouldn't say polarization, because I don't think that's like a 50-50 divide. People who are kind of online and engaged in Western discourse are very energized about Ukraine, because they realize that this is kind of a great cause of the moment, and they very much want to be on the right side of history. That's a term that's been bandied about over the past couple of weeks. So there's pressure coming from that side of the political spectrum to, be very open about admitting refugees from Ukraine, and taking a stronger stance, fully adopting the sanctions, not worrying so much about antagonizing the Russians. I would say that's a minority position in Israel, because Israelis kind of have an idea of realpolitik that just happens when you live in a place that's so dangerous. Of realpolitik, right? Just the dark necessities of politics, and they're less likely to be swept away by what seems right at a given moment, and sometimes this can be frustrating. Because they understand that we live in a very dangerous region where the forces are, treacherous, and where we have to be very careful. What's the treacherous force in this case? Because of the vacuum that was created in Syria during the Syrian civil war, in part by decisions made by the Obama administration, which we don't have to go into, but 2011, 2012, Russia moves into Syria, helps Assad win the civil war, and establishes itself in Syria, to the point where we have a border with Russia. Israel has a border with Russia. There are Russian troops and Russian airplanes on our northeastern border, which is a 2.5-hour drive from my apartment in Jerusalem. And Israeli planes and Russian planes fly a few yards away from each other. And there was an incident a few years ago where a Russian aircraft was shot down, and it almost caused a huge incident between Israel. It did cause an incident. It didn't cause a rupture in ties, but it's a very tricky situation where the Russians control airspace in Syria, but are allowing Israel to attack Iranian targets in Syria. Israel's eager to intercept arms transfers from Syria to Hezbollah and Lebanon and to degrade the Iranian presence inside Syria. For whatever complicated reason, the Russians are letting us do it. They could stop us from doing it.
I was going to ask you really quickly, is it true, put your journalist hat on, is it true that Russia was one of the harsher parties in the Iranian nuclear deal? In other words, keeping Iran in line.
I'm not sure.
It's an overgeneralization, but the role that they played over the last however many years in a deal that I don't personally believe is feasible. But you just sort of sounded a little bit, not you, but we as the Israelis were kind of in an excited sort of way shocked that Russia was allowing these flights. Was it true that Russia was at the table sort of keeping Iran in line, both past and present?
I'm not sure. And you asked
I
me,
know
you asked me to put my journalist hat on, which means...
Okay, take your journalist hat off, go back to just regular Joe Schmo Israeli.
Having a journalist hat on...
And what did they say at the coffee shop?
Having a journalist hat on for me means saying
accuracy.
Things I don't know with great confidence. That's the journalistic talent. So let me explain to you about the Iran deal. I'm just kidding. I don't...
we have AIPAC to do that for
Yes,
us.
exactly. The Russians are utter cynics. And if you're trusting them to keep the Iranians in line, everyone's going to be very disappointed. They are out for the Russian interest, and that changes. But I think fundamentally, it's not necessarily.
But is it fair
in
to
Israel's
say Bibi
interest.
had a little bit of a man crush on Putin?
It might have been the other way around. I think they might have appreciated certain qualities in each other. But definitely Israel is being very careful about Russia and sees very little to gain by antagonizing the Russians.
What I'm trying to do is provoke that it's not easy.
It's not easy. I mean, Israel...
It's not easy to understand, nor is it easy to understand what's happening right now.
Israel can't sway the war in Ukraine one way or another.
Right.
And you can see what Israel's trying to do, help as much as it can without crossing the line and antagonizing the Russians and endangering that situation on the northeastern border. It's unsatisfying for many people, including sometimes for me. I'd like to be solidly on the right side, and the right side in this is clearly the Ukrainian side, but we have other interests, and we're not in Ukraine, we're not in Eastern Europe, we have Middle Eastern considerations, and I think that more or less our leadership has been doing the right thing.
Are you concerned that there's going to be an underlying undercurrent of the Jews won't engage? And therefore, the Jews caused, we already know that we caused everything, but and we're going to get attacked no matter what, but is there a secondary negative impact of, it's not just Israel, it's the Jews, as that line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism begins to disappear, that the Jews enabled Russia?
I think there's always going to be that. You're always going to have that stuff, and you saw it a bit last week when people were really on Israel's case about not being on the right side. People weren't really too concerned about where the Turks are, or the Chinese, but for some reason people will look at Israel. Israel is a lightning rod for discontent and criticism. So whatever issue is alive in the world at a given time will be directed at Israel. A good example was the COVID vaccine rollout. If you remember, people were concerned about who's getting vaccines and who isn't, and that became a story about whether Israel was going to give the Palestinians vaccines or not. And the Palestinian Authority was saying, we don't want your Israeli vaccines, but nonetheless, that became a story. It's a way of understanding the world, right? What Jewish obsessions, what is sometimes called anti-Semitism, what that is a way of understanding the world for stupid people. That's basically what it is, because the world is so complicated that you can't understand, what is inequality? How do you even wrap your head around that term? Or what is, what is a war? Why does the world look like it looks? It's very hard to understand, right? One way of understanding it is by pointing at the Jews and saying, those people are doing it wrong. Let's not be like those people. And that takes us way out of the realm of journalism and into the realm of philosophy and Western psychology. But it's very present, and it's present in a lot of debates that pretend to be about something else, including in the debate about what Israel should be doing in Ukraine.
Right. Last question I have, and then I'm going to turn it over, and then just jump in with anything else that I forgot to ask. Do you think if what's happening in Ukraine right now happened in Israel right now, that the U.S., that Israelis think that the U.S. would jump in, that would be different? So Israel's attacked by Syria. Israel's attacked by Lebanon, Egypt. Go back to 73. Does the U.S. engage, or is it we're sending you lots of hugs and wishes and food boxes and some arms, and it's your monkey, not ours? What's the Israeli perspective?
I think the Israeli assumption has always been that we will have to fight our wars by ourselves. And that's always been the case, by the way. If you look at Israel's wars, American troops didn't show up to fight in Israel in 1973 or in 1967 or at any point. So America helps Israel in many, many ways, but there are no American lives on the line. And I think that's the way Israel wants it. I don't think Israel wants American soldiers fighting our wars. We want to be able to, successfully prosecute our wars by ourselves, and America helps us to do that. But Israel stands on its own feet, right? And that makes Israel different than many other American
So in
allies.
that way, Israel does not idealize its relationship with the U.S. or the United States in the same way that American Jews and Americans may idealize our role in Israel. And that's a big deal. We're seeing it differently now, yeah?
Yeah, fewer illusions.
But we still have anti-Semitism, which is, I'm sure, going to come up in our Q&A. So here's what we're going to do, Q&A, folks. We were exactly 45 minutes, by the way. And now we've got about 40 minutes. We really wanted a majority of tonight to be your questions. What we want to do is sometimes we do the thing where we'll say, hey, let's do 3 or 4 questions. But like you, we want to do one question at a time. Questions, though. Questions. Let me do the long-winded commentary with no real point. Don't do that to yourselves. I'm used to it. That's what I'm here for. So I get to do the Donna Jew, and that's Donahue, that's Jewish people. People! All right. Matti, are you ready for Congregation Beth Israel? We are good at Q&A.
Bring it on.
Well, we're good at the Q. The A is up to you. Jeff, I always give Jeff the opening question because he's not shy.
What?
Oh, everyone hold the mic close to your mouth, but not, we're still kind of COVID-ish, so not too close.
What is the impact of the Abraham Accords between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors?
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Did everyone hear the impact of the Abraham Accords, which is the name given to these new agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and kind of Sudan? I was actually in the UAE 10 days ago, and I've been to the UAE twice in the past year, once in Dubai, which is kind of the economic center, and once in Abu Dhabi, which is the political center. That's where the embassies are. And I flew, I got on an airplane at Ben Gurion Airport, and it said on the flight, sign, it says, Abu Dhabi, or it says Dubai, and the flight path, you're used to flying from Israel west, right? You fly, you leave Israel and fly over the Mediterranean heading west. The plane takes off and it goes east, and suddenly you see on the flight map that you're over Saudi Arabia, right? Which would have been unthinkable a year and a half ago. And on the first flight that I took to Dubai, it was about 2 weeks after the first flights had begun. Everyone's looking at the flight map, the Israelis on the plane, and because we can't believe it. We're flying over Saudi Arabia, and the plane kind of banks over Riyadh, which is an enemy capital, or at least that's what we thought it was until a few weeks before. And then you land in the Persian Gulf, and you get off the plane, and the Israelis have decided, in classic Israeli fashion, that the UAE is like Netanya, like they're home. So you see in the airport, it's there's guys with black hats in the airport and kippot and big Magen David necklaces, and in the malls they've got crazy malls in the UAE, and it's like shula, bring the shula tavit atik, bring the bag, and it's Hebrew in the malls, and the Israelis have kind of settled in, and it's a kind of a revolution. It's kind of a revolution, and I think there's some discomfort about those accords because they were engineered by people who a lot of people don't like. You know, like the fact that the Trump administration pulled that off and Netanyahu, that kind of rankles, I think, for some people. And I'm not a Netanyahu voter, but you have to give a ton of credit to those guys for however they did it. You know, whatever dark, crude capitalist mechanisms were engaged to bring about that outcome. It's the best. It's the biggest breakthrough in the Middle East in 30 years, and it's huge, in my opinion. Just this week, we've had a terrible week, right, of terror attacks, but also this week we had 4 Arab foreign ministers in Israel, not just in Israel, at Sde Boker, which is where Ben Gurion is buried, and where he lived the last part of his life. So Ben
Yeah, I
Gurion's
was going to ask you earlier, can you talk about a little bit more about that symbolism?
Sure. I mean, this is really a symbol of Zionism. They weren't in a hotel in Tel Aviv. They were at a symbol of Zionist settlement. And these are foreign ministers with whom we had officially no contact a year and a half ago. And it kind of seems like a new Middle East, not in the way that we used to imagine in the 90s when we thought it would be peace and brotherhood, and that's what I hoped was happening when I moved to Israel and, was happy to vote for the Labor Party again and again and again. This is a different kind of arrangement. It's darker, it's, if idealistic in the way it presents itself, but it's still huge. There are direct flights to Morocco, which is amazing, especially if we remember that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis are Moroccan, and there are direct flights every day. There are several flights a day to Dubai, which is incredible. Business is happening, money's coming back and forth. I'm reporting a story on date agriculture. There's a lot of cooperation on date agriculture because everyone eats dates, and Israel has some really good tech to help people growing dates. There's a lot going on, and people who think it's just like an arms deal or just like some kind of detail that doesn't really matter as Israel pursues the peace that really matters, which is the peace with the Palestinians. That's not true. Something really big happened with those accords. Something that was in the basement has been brought out of the basement, and it's going to shape the Middle East in the next couple of years, particularly as American influence wanes in the Middle East, which is one of the drivers of the Abraham Accords. Ironically, America's kind of allies in the Middle East are getting closer and closer to each other because they have less and less faith in the Americans. That's part of what's going on.
Thank you. Steve.
So you haven't talked about the 800-pound gorilla yet, but I want to drill down in one question. What is this?
Wait, what was the gorilla?
Palestinian question.
Oh, okay.
But isn't it fascinating that we went an hour without the Palestinian question coming up? 5 years ago, that wouldn't have happened.
It's a bit less than
I want to drill down on just one part of it. Mahmoud Abbas is obviously 80s. We know all that. What is your crystal ball? What do the Israelis think is going to happen if this guy, when he does, or he's just not in the scene anymore? Is it going to be complete chaos? What's going to happen? That's a great question.
Anyone who will predict the future in Israel or anywhere is going to look like a fool probably within a few days. So I'm not going to fall into that trap. But I can say that more broadly about how Israel handles things. Israel is really good at the short term. Let's put it that way. That's a positive way to put it. The long term is not our strong suit. And when you live in a country that's just constant emergencies day after day, what you're basically trying to do is get through the week. And that's what Israel does. And that actually turns out to have a kind of power, because Israel's got through week by week for 74 years almost. So it kind of works, but it doesn't really lend itself to long-term planning. I don't think there really is a plan for what happens when Abbas dies, which will probably be not too long in the future. And you have to see who replaces him. I mean, the Oslo paradigm, which still kind of exists, even though it hasn't really mattered since about the year 2000, I think will change once he's gone. You have this thing called the Palestinian Authority, which is set up as part of the Oslo Accords. It's supposed to take over the power vacuum that Israel is creating by withdrawing from Palestinian areas in Gaza and the West Bank. But Israel pulls out of Gaza in 2005, and Hamas takes over. That's not the Oslo paradigm, and that's not Mahmoud Abbas. In the 90s, when Israel pulls out of Palestinian cities, it's not really the Palestinian Authority who takes over, it's the suicide bombers. And we get hit with the worst wave of terrorism that we'd ever experienced. So there are kind of leftovers from the 90s that seem to exist. So people quote Mahmoud Abbas as the the Palestinian president as if that's something with real power, but it's not really. The Palestinian Authority, if you just draw aside the curtain, it's American dollars protected by Israeli soldiers. That's basically what it is. And people have an interest in maintaining it because it helps maintain stability. It's kind of a good setup for people. And Mahmoud Abbas is part of that setup. And once he's gone, we'll see if another leader kind of replaces him with the same attitude, which is basically let's keep things more or less together and not let things deteriorate. May do some business on the side.
No, it's good for business for the people behind the curtain to keep it status quo.
Absolutely, there are other interests involved that are not. The interest is not democracy for the Palestinians necessarily. Unfortunately, as someone
So I guess
who would love
everyone
to
has
see,
oligarchs.
I think ultimately someone is going to be running the show. In any country, someone is going to be running the show, and you better hope that it's someone who cares about you.
So the question for those online was the next day, or let's give him Shiva. A week later, you don't want to give him Shiva. That's the chaos. Does it go and become chaotic immediately?
Again, I won't risk a prediction, but I will say that there was supposed to be a Palestinian election about 8 months ago.
Correct. That got moved.
And when
And
it became
and very underreported as it
when it
turned out.
became clear that Hamas was going to win the election, then the elections went away and somehow weren't held. The last time the Palestinians voted, the last time anyone felt like letting the Palestinians elect their leadership, 2006.
George W. Bush.
They voted for Hamas. So there's good reason to believe that any power vacuum that's created in the West Bank will follow what happened in Gaza, which is the vacuum will be filled by Hamas. And that's why people like the Americans and the Israelis have an interest in Mahmoud Abbas remaining in power and not risking the day after, but eventually the day after is going to come.
Right. And remember, we talked about this in Lunch and Learn last May when we were talking about the fourth election in 18 months in Israel, about that other election that got postponed in Ramallah, and the rationale for it being totally rational, if you think about it from the perspective of the PA. Questions? Mark. Oh, and then Terry, but Mark and then Terry.
Yeah, my question is about Israel's relationship with Iran and what the Israeli approach to Iran and what plans there may be if Iran does what we hope it doesn't do. I hope that makes sense.
Meaning develop a nuclear weapon? Yeah. So the Iranian issue is, of course, a huge one for Israelis, and the nuclear question is really, it kind of gets most of the attention, but it's really hard to wrap your head around nuclear annihilation. Like, that's so theoretical that I find it very difficult to even think about. But the truth is that the Iranian threat isn't just a nuclear bomb. The Iranians fill every power vacuum that presents itself in the Middle East. For example, Lebanon is a state that's so weak that it has de facto become an Iranian kind of protectorate. So on our northern border, we have a military force called Hezbollah, which is the strongest military force in Lebanon, but it's not the Lebanese army. It's an Iranian proxy force. And in Syria, the Iranians are more or less in control. That's on our northeastern border. Hamas is affiliated with Iran. Islamic Jihad in Gaza is a full-on Iranian proxy. Yemen has a proxy force called the Houthis, which are kind of an arm of the Iranians. The Revolutionary Guards will move into any vacuum that presents itself, and that's one reason that you're not going to see a withdrawal from Palestinian territory as was envisioned in the Oslo years. Because now it's clear that if you create a vacuum, it won't become a Palestinian democracy. What will happen is what happened in Lebanon, which is that the Revolutionary Guards will come in. And it might look like something else. It might have some kind of Palestinian face on it. But the power in the Middle East, the rising power, is Iran. And I had my own, it's not a theoretical situation for me, and as it is for many Israeli men. I served in South Lebanon at the end of the 1990s in a kind of a strip of land that we called the security zone, which was meant to keep Hezbollah guerrillas, not the 800-pound guerrillas that we were discussing earlier, but the other kind of guerrillas far from our border. And one night, I won't tell you the whole story because it would take too long, and it's not why we came, but one night in February 1998, I was in an armored personnel carrier on a narrow dirt road near an outpost in South Lebanon called the Pumpkin, and we hit 3 IEDs. That's what we'd call them now. No one used that term at the time. One of them blew off the tread. One of them blew a big hole about the size of a basketball in the bottom of the vehicle. And one, which is called a claymore, which sprays pellets and nails, kind of sprayed the side of the vehicle. I had my torso out of the vehicle, and I felt it. I can still feel it, kind of. It was hot, and it felt like being punched in the nose, and I blacked out for a few seconds. Those were Iranian bombs, and they were planted by people who were trained by Iran. So it's not a theoretical threat for Israelis. The Iranians are on the march. And when Israelis seem hysterical about Iran, and I think often to Americans, certainly American liberals, the Israelis seem hysterical. Like, what are you so worried about? What are you worried about Iran having a nuclear bomb? You have one, So what's the problem? But it's not just the nuclear bombs. It's a power that is taking over the Middle East, that sees itself as the ascendant power in the Middle East, and sees its goal as knocking out the evil forces in the Middle East. The evil forces in the Middle East being the little Satan, that's me, and the great Satan, which is you. And you can choose not to take that seriously, but I've been in the Middle East for long enough that I take the rhetoric of our enemies seriously. And I think that when the Iranians say death to Israel, which is one of the slogans of the Iranian regime, they mean it. That's not just for internal consumption. They believe that. And of course, the other slogan is death to America. But you guys can choose whether or not you want to believe that one.
I'm going to lighten things up.
Thank you very much. Can we get back to music?
I really enjoyed Aleppo Codex and Spies. Okay. But I am an obsessive Leonard Cohen fan, so I'm going to bring it back. I was curious if you had seen the concert in 2009, and if he was with us for a few more years after that and touring. Did you ever get to interview him?
So thank you for that question. I didn't go to the concert in 2009. And to my eternal regret, being a silly young person, I just figured I would catch him next time. He was 75. What next time was there going to be? I don't know. But I didn't go, and I've been regretting it ever since, certainly when I wrote this book, which talks a lot about that concert. But I do have a story about interviewing Leonard Cohen, which is that I got onto this story in 2009. Cohen's alive and well. And I started clipping these articles about the Sinai tour, and I was, kind of taking my time. Again, when you're young, you don't understand that time is limited and that you really have to hurry up if your interviewees are aging. And I just thought I had all the time in the world. And then in 2016, he gave an interview to The New Yorker. You might have read the profile that David Remnick wrote of Cohen in The New Yorker in 2016. Great article, by the way, really worth reading. And it's clear in that article that Cohen is ill, that he's very ill. And I said, oh my goodness, I better get my act together. And I realized that my Canadian publisher, McClellan Stewart, is also Leonard Cohen's publisher. And I got in touch with my editor, and I said, listen, I have an idea for a book. It's about Cohen's Sinai tour. He said, that sounds like a good idea. I said, can I get to Leonard Cohen? And he said, yeah. And I said, really? Like, I can interview Leonard Cohen? And he said, yes, we know his people, and we'll set it up. I couldn't believe it, right? That would have been like too much. And he said, just write a pitch for the book, explain what you're trying to write, and send it to me. So I wrote a pitch. I got down, kind of explained what I was going to write. I pasted that famous photograph that is inside this book of Cohen with Ariel Sharon. Have you guys ever seen that photograph from Sinai where you see Cohen singing next to Sharon? It's really something. So I put that.
Was it a duet?
Not to the best of my knowledge. Sharon had other talents, but music, I think, wasn't one of them. The document goes off to my editor, and I'm thrilled. As far as I know, like within a few weeks, I'm sitting with Leonard Cohen in his living room, interviewing him. So I sent it off, went to bed, woke up the next morning, and got an email back from my editor. The subject line, and pardon my language, was "Holy shit." And it was a link to the obituary. I didn't interview him. I missed him. Wow. That was my story about not interviewing him.
So he heard you were coming, and
he was like, no way, not this guy. But
there's only one way out of this interview.
But then the way I feel about it is that fate takes and fate gives, and then I found this manuscript that he'd written. So instead of interviewing him as an old man, I got the young Cohen in very raw form writing immediately after the war. And ultimately, I think that was probably more worthwhile than an interview. At least that's what I try to tell myself.
No, that's another wow story. Friends, Laszlo, coming. We're going to do maybe 2 more questions after this and then wrap her up.
How do you see the peace with Egypt that has never warmed up, and how will the Egyptian elite manage the never-ending problems and the demographic crisis that Egypt has?
So the question is about the Israeli-Egyptian peace, which was, of course, a subject or a development that sparked incredible optimism, and I was 2 years old when it happened, but there are people here who probably remember Sadat's visit to Israel and how exciting that was, and it never turned into a warm peace. So the peace these days with the UAE is warm. Like when you go to the UAE, you feel that the country is smiling at you. They want Israelis to come. There are ads for things in the UAE and Tel Aviv, and there's really an attempt to kind of make it as warm as possible. And that is very, very different from the peace with Egypt, which has always been a peace between the regimes. It's there's security cooperation, there's peace, there's officially peace, but there's a lot of hostility in Egypt. I've been to Egypt a few times. The first time I went, I made the mistake of saying I was Jewish, which you shouldn't do if you go there. Take it from me. There's a lot of hostility there to Israel to this day, and it's seen as kind of an arrangement that the government had to make, but it does not have popular support. Sisi, who's the dictator of Egypt right now, has been making warmer noises toward Israel. It seems like he wants into the kind of Abraham Accord club, and he sent his foreign minister to this confab this week at Sde Boker, which is amazing when we're thinking about the Yom Kippur War, right? Not that long ago, slaughter on the Israeli-Egyptian border. And even if we don't have a piece of brotherhood and love at the moment, we don't have that. And of course, we have much to be grateful for.
Any last couple questions? Did you have a follow-up also? So tell us, where do we take these stories? What do the next 10 years look like in the American Jewish-Israeli relationship? But also we have this poisonous thing called social media, called Facebook, called Instagram. It's toxicity. It's a cancer in the world that has created more anti-Semites. So where are we in relationship with each other, in relationship to almost a new wave, a new breed of filthier anti-Semitism vis-a-vis social media? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I'm never sure if social media has created more anti-Semitism or has made the existing anti-Semitism visible, which is a terrifying thought. Like, it's possible that it was always this way, but we just didn't know because we didn't have any way to see it. But it's certainly clear that the world that I grew up in the 1990s, where I thought anti-Semitism was an old story that my grandparents were telling, it's clear that is not at all the case, and that in fact these ideas remain incredibly powerful in different forms, on the right, on the left, in different cultures. And they remain, I think, just an easy way of understanding events. It's hard to understand the economy, right, how that works, but it's easy to understand Jewish bankers manipulating the markets for their own, nefarious gain. And these ideas are powerful. They motivated the shooter in Pittsburgh, and they motivated the people who, burn Israeli flags outside the embassies, and they motivate all kinds of different people who take all kinds of different actions that seem contradictory or seem to be different things, but are united by this idea that the illustration of evil in the world is Jews in whatever form. It doesn't
help that Facebook's founder is named Zuckerberg. It doesn't help that the Jewish names associated with Twitter, with all these companies, and when you look at the C-suite positions, are Jewish surnames. So again, does Israel have a role to play, first of all, being the cybersecurity juggernaut that it is, in helping to modify these? And I think you're probably right. The anti-Semitism was always there. It's a cancer that exists without a cure. The only cure is dead Jews if you're an anti-Semite, right? And I agree with you. You believe the people who say that. I mean, we're learning that the hard way in this country. We spend our little synagogue in Scottsdale, Arizona, spends $250,000 a year on security. 250,000. I can't tell you how many campers I can send to camp with that, and how many kids I could send to Israel with that. $250,000 a year in Scottsdale, Arizona on security. Not that that's Israel's responsibility, but it's changed. Our budget 10 years ago was probably $15,000 a year.
And it's an amazing, those are amazing numbers. What I try to do is not get drawn into the world of social media craziness. And some might say that the answer to this kind of poison on social media is to get on social media and scream back. I like to think about Herzl. In fact, I like to think about Herzl more than is probably healthy. But there's a great biography of Herzl written by Amos Elon. It's called Herzl, and it's one of my favorite books. And when you read about Herzl, I think it gives us kind of inspiration and guidance on particularly this point. Herzl is an assimilated Jew. He's really got one foot already into, Jewish oblivion. His son isn't circumcised. He has a Christmas tree at home. He's on his way out. And like many Jews in Vienna, like many upper-class Jews in Vienna. But then he starts hearing this buzz in Vienna, these stories about Jews, about nefarious Jews, things that he thought had been, relegated to the past. Jewish control, Jewish conspiracy, Jewish manners. And his step toward assimilation is halted by this. And he doesn't do what everyone else was doing in his social circles, which is to pretend that it's not about him. Instead, he starts to think about the problem of the Jews, and he comes to the conclusion that Jewish reality has to be changed. So Herzl doesn't go around Vienna arguing with people about anti-Semitism, right? He doesn't try to change the narrative. He doesn't, get on Facebook and, campaign, or he doesn't do memes. He sits down at his desk and writes a book that changes the world. And it's such an unlikely story that sometimes I can't even believe that it happened. But I live in the result of that change. Like, Herzl sits down at his desk and he writes a book called The Jewish State. And the idea is we're not going to argue with these people. We're kind of going to give them the finger and drive off into the sunset in our convertible. And we're going to do something completely different. And we're not going to shape people's minds in Vienna, and we're not going to argue about the stories. We're going to reshape reality. That's what we're going to do. We're going to go off and we're going to make our own place, and that's where we're going to be, and the world is going to remain as bad as it always was, but we are going to have our own place, and that's where Zionism has always succeeded. It's never succeeded in the realm of, storytelling, and it has not succeeded in eliminating anti-Semitism. Where it has succeeded is by creating a country that has revolutionized Jewish life in our times. And that's the big difference between our times and Herzl's time. We have a state. And the state is deeply flawed, as all states are, and it can be, infuriating at times. But the Jewish Revolution has been successfully carried out, and it was carried out by people who kept their eyes on reality, not on social media and not on stories, on reality. So if you ever feel kind of upset, or if you ever see too much crap on Facebook, the thing to do, in my opinion, is to get on a plane, if possible, and fly to Israel, and get off the plane, and you will be in a country that will be surprising and maybe, disappointing in some ways, but real. And that's the country I see every day when I open my window. And that's the ultimate antidote, in my opinion, to what you're describing.
We're ending there. We started with Cohen. We end with Herzl. Everyone, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope this will be the first of many times that we see you, and we will see you in Israel in just a few months, which we need to arrange. Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone for being here. Everyone online, thank you so much. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to any questions from the online community, but thank you all very much. And our next Centennial Scholar event will be on April 14th with, April 13th, even better, a day earlier with Sarah Hurwitz, who is Michelle Obama's former speechwriter, but really wrote a beautiful book and beautiful story about her journey back into Judaism post-White House, and she will be with us on the 13th. That's our next Centennial Scholar, so we look forward to seeing you then. Have a great evening. Thank you.